I can tell you right now, and coming from that OT side of the house, from a systems development integration standpoint, IT is not normally in the room, hardly at all, as being part of the narrative of what technology is being brought in, or what technology is there, or what kind of remote access do these folks have, and what do they do when they're there, to start figuring out how can we start doing a better job providing patching strategy.
Welcome to the Industrial Cybersecurity Insider. In each episode, we dive into the world of industrial cybersecurity. Join us as we cover the latest trends, innovations, and practical insights as we talk with leaders and practitioners across the industry. Gear up and let's get into this week's episode.
My name is Craig Duckworth.
And I'm Dino, and today we're going to talk about IT versus OT patching and software updates.
Given that, Dino, how would you say patching on the OT side differs from that on the IT side? Because that is a very great conversation to have.
IT patches everything all the time pretty much, right? So patch. That's their standard way of staying ahead of the curve and keeping up with the patches that are put out by the software vendors, right? On the OT side, they don't patch very often, hardly at all. So it's creating a big gap of vulnerabilities that you find in an OT environment, which is connected to an IT environment. So you have one organization that's consistently and constantly patching, right? Patch Tuesday, as we still call it, the Microsoft patches that come out. And those get pushed out pretty quickly and immediately for most organizations. And then on the OT side, it's a rare occurrence.
Yeah, I've heard definitely Patch Tuesday. Everybody in the enterprise IT organization is familiar with that. It affects all of us when we come in and log onto our laptop. Recognizing that there are Microsoft devices down in that OT network, whether they are engineering workstations, they are HMIs, how different or unique challenges that would present as you attempt to or completely ignore, maybe that's not the right word, but don't patch, as you would say, in that OT space?
Now, there's a couple of things to note there. One, and everybody's experienced this, it's taken a patch and it's changed something or broke something. And in the office environment, is it really a big deal for that disruption, that minor disruption? And IT can be pretty quick sometimes about rolling the patch back out if the patch was too disruptive. But on the OT space, those disruptions will shut down your plant floor, which is very costly, which is a big difference between somebody not being able to load their email or get to their email versus I got a packaging line that's not producing goods, right? It's very expensive. And a lot of organizations, for example, don't have virtual machines running their HMIs, for example. And so the rebuild of that, to uninstall and reinstall, can take time, can take hours, if not days. I've witnessed, especially if you have machines that have older Windows operating systems on them. So that's challenge number one. The other challenge in it is that, a lot of the OT assets are out there for decades, right? Their life cycle is much different. And so in order to patch, you may not have the physical resources on the equipment to be able to even do the patches, right? Memory requirements, process requirements. And there's also patching has to come at certain levels, meaning that it's got to be, you can't just jump from patch 1 to 10 to get all the other 9 in. Sometimes you got to patch 1, 2, then 7, and then 8 to get to 10. And also, in a lot of cases, the SCADA applications or the control system applications have to move with the operating system. So if you're a Rockwell shop, if you're going to move the Windows operating system up a few patch levels, well, you also have to move the SCADA software up a few patch levels also. All right, so they got to sometimes go hand in hand. And so that work, in order to determine that, can, again, costly downtime to work to get it done. And so in the OT world, they just tend to ignore it because of the disruption to get from one level to the next.
Well, I can see that as if I were controls engineer, I were plant manager, and I'm being metriced and bonused on uptime, I would be hesitant to introduce something into my environment that's potentially could be a downtime issue. That's a completely different with, if I come in the morning and I take a patch and my laptop doesn't boot up and I don't have emails for 2 or 3 hours, it's no big deal. I can catch up. But
You
if
find
I'm,
something else to do.
yeah, I'll go to the break room and I'll have a coffee or two and sit there and chat with my buddies. But if I'm on the plant and I can't produce goods for 3 or 4 hours or that same time window, there's a hard cost to the organization for that downtime.
The OEMs that sometimes that have the responsibility to maintain and support that machine center won't allow you to patch those systems too. So you got what we call the OEM blockade, right? Where the OEM is like, if you touch the machine center, you're going to avoid the warranty, right? And
Yeah.
a lot of clients haven't done a very good job of negotiating those terms up front in order to say, look, we have cybersecurity initiatives in here. And OT cybersecurity is a fairly new phenomenon, right? I mean, even though it's been around for several years, and we've said this multiple times through multiple podcasts, 60% are still from the unaware to aware phase of these OT cybersecurity tools that provide them vulnerability management information to give them the advisory bulletins required for the patching strategy in order to patch up. So that's another deflection point with OEM saying you can't touch the machine. So that's another barrier that the manufacturers are up against.
And then you take and introduce the safety aspect into it. Let's say that a machine is operating and you introduce a patch that kills a safety PLC or kills a safety program, and the machine potential harm to individuals in the plant or the environment or other things.
Yeah, quality issues, right? So it is definitely a different approach that needs to be had. And IT is not aligned with that situation per se. They just know the plant floor doesn't patch and they just kind of leave it alone, which is why we see this break a lot of times between IT and OT from a security strategy because of scenarios like this, right? And organizations aren't really doing a really good job of studying their plant floor situation. And we see it all the time. You know, when all these mergers and acquisitions, for example, manufacturer goes and buys a plant, but they're really not doing their due diligence on the situation, the computing platforms, the networking platforms status on their industrial side, right? You know what I mean? There could be malware already in there within the plant, right? A lot of vulnerabilities that already exist. And so the new manufacturer, who's buying this plant, they don't know what they're getting at the end of the day, you know, in a lot of ways.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I'm really surprised that we don't see more equity firms that are doing mergers and acquisitions, leveraging the technologies today that we see in the industrial space to go in and get that true vulnerabilities and asset inventory to say, you're trying to sell me a $100 million plant. I run my analysis and it's old, it's outdated, everything that you've got in it is dilapidated. I'm going to give you 30 million because it's going to cost me 80 million to fix it all.
About 80 million, but it's a huge effort in order to determine the current state of the cybersecurity posture within that manufacturing environment. And they don't have good asset visibility. You know, when they go in there, they're not getting a really good asset inventory of the environment to determine the status of those machines. And getting back to the research piece, there's technologies out there, for example, you know, because you can't run agents per se on a lot of these OT assets. And as of today, so mark this date, July 19th, CrowdStrike, right, is having an issue, right? And it's an EDR in a lot of cases where you got a lot of businesses are being impacted by a problem between Microsoft and CrowdStrike, right? It's causing downtime. Imagine having that on your plant floor today. You're not even having visibility of what's happened in your environment. And so when you think about virtual patching, where you have the ability to take a machine center and put technology in there that knows the vulnerability of that asset, and based on that is able to virtual patch. And virtual patching means that if there's remote code execution, denial of service, you know, or Stack Overflow kind of activity that can happen because you don't have the proper patching level in your CVs, there's technology that you can put in front of that machine center that will provide patching for you. You know, so like on a Windows machine, you put patching on the Windows operating system running that HMI. Well, how do you do that with a PLC, right? For example,
Right.
You can't put an agent on there. And so you have to put something in front of it. And a firewall is not sufficient for this, right?
No.
So you have to have something that's doing virtual patching. And one of our strategic partners does that, does it really, really well. And it's a good, fast, quick way to say, look, I can't patch, but Yeah, you can. You know, if you looked at virtual patching solutions, and I guarantee you there's so few organizations out there, one, that even know what that is, or even looked at technologies to determine how that might be a benefit to them.
Yeah, there are. And you made a great point. There are other methods. There's not a one silver bullet fixes everything. There are different ways to approach this. Some organizations put it in a lab environment and they run, let's call it smoke tests, and they screen testing. They make sure that it's going to work with the revolutions and the versions that they're going to put it on before they go into a production environment. Some organizations don't have that lab or test environment, and they don't have that luxury, let's call it, to do that. So it's really a gamble when they go into a live environment to try and do this.
Well, and again, you got to look at the vintage. I was at a manufacturing facility yesterday. They had equipment that's been in there since the 30s and 40s. And people would say, holy smokes, how would that be even applicable to today? Well, even though the equipment is that old, the control systems that are in front of it are newer. They might be 15 years old. And so the question then is, what can you do? And we have the capability today to put things like virtual patching in front of those machines. And my take on it is, IT is very standardized, right? They run the same computing platforms. They have typically the same networking infrastructure. They have the same databases, right? They have applications that are very standardized as far as their ERPs and their CRMs and their email system, et cetera. You go on the plant floor, none of that exists, right? I don't want to call it the Wild West, but you're going to find a whole host of different technologies spanning 20, 30 years, 10, 15 years in that plant. And knowing that, right, is like, well, how am I going to even be able to begin to start this journey? And it starts with the first step, right? It starts with the first plant. Again, back to that 60, 30, 10 that we talk about, where are you in this journey? And have you even begun doing anything? And it's a resource issue, because most organizations, because IT is so standardized, they can get away with a couple people potentially running a particular technology within the organization. But when you get into the plant floor, you can have hundreds of these different technologies, and you don't have enough people to be able to look at one plant compared to another plant, compared to a third plant. So even if let's say you're a beverage plant, right, and you've got 30 plants in your fleet, well, no 30 of them are the same per se, right? And they were built at different times. They have different technologies in there. So you have to get back to who are the boots on the ground that are closest to that equipment to give you the most valuable information you can to determine what strategic direction you want to go to start tackling with these new technologies, where you can start from the level of standardization for OT cybersecurity, right? Intrusion detection systems that are agnostic, that look at these things that are 20 and 30 years old, right? To provide you rich content and device information around those machines that you have in your environment that are running on networks, that are running firmware, that are running operating systems, that are running applications, and start building a baseline.
Right.
To determine how you might patch what you can't patch. And well, if I can't physically take Rockwell patches and Microsoft patches, well, maybe I can put virtual patches around that system, right, in front of it.
How much vendor participation or support are we seeing out there? Meaning from the automation vendor technology partners, the Rockwell, the Siemens, the Schneiders, the Honeywells, to the technology partners that we interact with. Are you seeing a lot of collaboration between the two you mentioned earlier, if you can only go up so many revs until you have to change the operating systems and things, are we seeing publications and notifications from the automation vendors saying, hey, here's how we should do that, or we recommend this, or what are we seeing from that side? Anything?
Well, some are better than others. Like Rockwell had a lot of really high, CDEs that came out, the past year or so, right? And so they published the advisory bulletins on how you can mediate those. And some do, right? Some can't because of the particular situation with the equipment they have without having to go through what I want to call a rewrite, where I can't use that PLC in order to get to that level. I got to take that one out, put another one in. I can't use that version of the SCADA software. I got to take that one out, put a new one in. And now you're talking about hundreds of thousands of millions of dollars for a particular machine center to able to get it to a level of cybersecurity posture that would be acceptable, right? And so most they accept risk. The question is well, how much risk are you willing to accept, right? And look what's going on today. Everybody that's being impacted today by the issue that's going on with CrowdStrike, they have firewalls. That's not preventing this, right? They got a really good EDR tool, CrowdStrike, that's having a problem. We've seen this with SolarWinds, right? We have seen some huge breaches and vulnerabilities associated with technology that are used by these clients. Most will fall back and say, well, nobody's attacking the control systems. And it's like, well, how do you know that if you're not watching it, number one? Right? How do you know they're not in there researching and discovering in your environment, trying to learn it? Right? We find malware in a lot of cases in the work that we do when we go out there and start doing, our visibility studies and asset inventories within these organizations, and we start finding this weird stuff. I was at a plant here again just recently, and they use a lot of tablets, iPads, as part of their production environment. And they had 3 Wi-Fi networks, and there's a production network, and there's a guest network, and then there was another network for the warehouse. Well, some of those tablets were sitting on the guest network, but they're down below on the control system side that's running the applications within the plant. And the IT security guy, when he saw that, was taken back. It's like, why are they on the guest network? Well, first question you ask yourself is, why does that tablet even have access to the guest network, right? And again, it's because they're not watching it. They don't see the fact that think of that tablet might as well be an HMI. Think of an HMI sitting on the guest network, right? Is anybody attacking it? No. But is that allowable? Well, the answer to that is also no, right? And then what are you doing to solve that problem? You can send out an edict and say nobody should put the tablets on the Wi-Fi network. And then the operator that comes in at midnight and works on the third shift decides that he or she wants to look at their personal email, or maybe they want to access Netflix on it, right? Because they know they can get to Netflix through the guest network.
Yeah, so there's a lot of considerations that organizations need to make sure they are looking at as they try and develop strategies. I hear you talk about, in the past where the plant shut down for 1 week every year between Christmas and New Year's, and you've got 6 weeks worth of stuff trying to cram into 1 week's worth of time, and everybody wants their stuff put at the same time. So how do organizations try to prioritize, strategize, and make sure that they're taking the appropriate steps to get the right patches in place that are critical or needed versus a luxury or a nice to have?
Well, that's the two sides coming together, right? That's IT and OT trying to come together to make sense of what's going on in their environment, right? To try to learn as much of it as they can. And then again, if you got 30 plants in your fleet, how many people does it take to do that? And also you have to get the ecosystem, as I call it, of OT partners have to also be engaged in this conversation. So whether it's the OEM who's providing you this machine center or the SI who's building out the control systems around that machine center, what is their role? Because I can tell you right now, and coming from that OT side of the house, from a systems development integration standpoint, IT is not normally in the room, hardly at all, as being part of the narrative of what technology is being brought in, or what technology is there, or what kind of remote access do these folks have, and what do they do when they're there, to start figuring out how can we start doing a better job providing patching strategy and to provide, a security apparatus around these machines that we have in our plant floor, and have visibility into it. Again, you've heard me say this many times. Are you exercising the same amount of due diligence to secure and protect that plant floor as you do the enterprise? And the answer to that is no. And so the question is, do you lay it at the CISO and CIO's feet and say, hey, you need to figure this out? They're not going to do this by themselves. They can lead, they can be a part of it, they can help with the narrative, they can help with the budgeting, they can help describe the situation to the directors and the C-suite and the owners of a company. But you just can't have IT turn tail and run and go, look, I just want to put a firewall in and try to ignore that best I can. Again, I get back to everybody that's been breached. 100% of them, and I can say that for a fact, have had firewalls in the organization, and it did not stop the breach, right? So what are you doing to get better? And so best practices is get an asset inventory, continuously monitor, understand your vulnerabilities, and start putting some metrics around that thing. Look at your remote access into that environment, and what does that look like? Because OT comes into those plants 7 ways to Sunday to get in there. Right? They just do. And COVID kicked that door wide open because people couldn't travel. And now this air gap conversation, even for those that believe that their machines are still air gap because they're controlling the cable in and out of the network. When I want them in, I connect it in or I turn the switch. They get in, do their thing, I turn the switch off or I disconnect the cable. Well, how do you know that gets done? Because everybody that says that, there's always those 1 or 2 or 3 machine centers in there that are still hot, still connected. Right. Somebody didn't pull a cable, somebody didn't turn the switch, or when they remoted in via a cellular modem, which we find those too, and it's still hot and connected. Again, nobody's watching it.
A couple things as we kind of try to wrap this up. I would say, what are some significant consequences or potential consequences of not patching? We hear OT doesn't patch, OT doesn't patch. It's going to cause downtime. We don't want to do it. We can't test it. So are there significant consequences that could impact for not testing that we could say, hey, this is the case to do it safely in the right manner with the appropriate technologies versus just don't do it?
Well, there's also insurance impact, right? Because I can't get cybersecurity insurance because I don't have an asset inventory. I don't have vulnerability management metrics in these manufacturing facilities. So the insurance companies have gotten wiser and said, well, if you don't have that stuff, you're not getting it. Or your coverages are going way down and your costs for policies are going through the roof, right? So you have that scenario going on. You have those that have been breached who aren't necessarily communicating the fact that they have to their investors. Even though they've been forced to do so, regulatory requirements are saying, hey, if you're a publicly traded company, you're supposed to communicate to your investors within a few days that you've had a material breach. And the government has come and been lax on that depending on who you are.
Yeah.
Because they recognize it's like, I don't have several millions of dollars to go solve this problem. But at the same time, it's like, well, what are you doing to get better?
Right.
Have you done anything? I say smoke and mirrors is what some of them are doing. Say, I bought a tool, we're doing this. Like, yeah, you're just scratching the surface.
It's back to that 60-30-10 rule. Right. 90% of organizations are just beginning to try and figure it out. You got 10% that are really doing something and making the effort and are on the journey. The rest are not. So,
well, and what's the other thing? We heard it again this morning. We've heard it a couple of times. Why do they fall back? When they start seeing the cost of what it takes to do this, right? And so they didn't either budget for it appropriately or they haven't been able to articulate to the executives and the owners of an organization on why this is relevant and important. So they continue to want to roll the dice. They'll say that's an acceptable amount of risk. Well, what's an acceptable amount of risk when you don't even know what that acceptable amount of risk is?
That's where organizations like ours come in. We can help them with that process. We can help them with budgetary guidelines. We can help them. You mentioned that asset inventory. We can help them with that asset inventory. There are ways to manage it. You can't just blindly say, we're not going to do it because of X, Y, and Z. You can't. We will build that case for them, help them down that road so that they can go in educated and present that to the board of directors, the C-suite, to whoever's making that financial decision.
Well, in order to build that case, you got to get all the liars in the same room, right?
Yeah.
Number one, you do. And it's not just internal, it's external. A lot of external players involved in your manufacturing capabilities. Again, back to the OEMs, back to the SIs, that are also performing activity and work for you to help keep those machines running, right? So what is their role in this game? And again, it's an old term I've known for decades. You've got to get all the liars in the same room, right, to help solve this problem. And you can't just kick it over to IT and expect them to do it. Even where we are today, for the organizations that we work for, and I witnessed this when I worked for Rockwell, you have to get both sides to start having, a strategic, serious conversation around this in order to move forward, right?
Yeah. Great points all the way around. This conversation could be days. This is not going to go away. This is something that's going to take collaboration from both sides, can take strategically understanding the way that it works, but great food for thought for the listeners out there. We hope everybody, you got to start taking steps to protect the organizations. You have to make the next. Yeah, you got to get better period over period.
Both sides have to agree, are we getting better? It can't be just one side saying, oh, we're getting better. Would OT say that because IT bought a tool, because IT put a firewall in? Because even OT understand the ramifications of the fact, yeah, you put in a firewall, but I don't manage it. You manage it.
Yeah.
You update and patch that firewall on a pretty regular basis. Now what's changed in the environment? Because I'm not watching it on the bottom side to see what holes you've poked into my environment that weren't there before that are there now.
Yeah.
Or an OEM who comes in, or an SI who comes in and provides vulnerabilities in the environment, because you're not mapping and studying what they're doing either. So again, you got to get all the right folks in the same room and have a serious conversation about this. And sometimes you have to do it by plan. You can throw out a general blanket strategy and say, here's what we're generally going to do, but it's got to drift all the way down to the person that's actually standing in front of the interface on that machine center out there at the plant floor. So,
well, great conversation though.
Until next time.
Thanks for tuning in to the Industrial Cybersecurity Insider. To stay up to date with our latest episodes, be sure to click the follow or subscribe button now. And if you found this podcast helpful or have a topic you'd like us to discuss, please leave us a review or let us know. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.